You already know who she is. You've already heard her teach. So I'm just going to share some fun facts. I've got four fun facts so that we don't take a whole lot of time. One is a professor at Bright Divinity School whose disciple, Dr. Tim Lee. He's a church historian. And my husband, Brian, who's on our seminar today, he was a professor at Bright. And one day, Brian told Dr. Lee, "Hey, you have a new student in your class who really likes your class." And Dr. Lee asked, "Well, who is that?" And Brian said, "Lisa Barnett." And Dr. Lee immediately goes, "Does she have a photographic memory?" Because Lisa really can remember things better than anybody that I know. So she was already impressing people as a student.
Oh.
She is a cat person. She has a wonderful cat named Madden. If you ever go to
Mhm.
visit her, Madden will love you sometimes.
Yes.
Sometimes Madden likes to be all by himself. She is an excellent preacher. Excellent, excellent, excellent preacher. I hope you already know she's an excellent teacher, but she really, if you ever get an opportunity to hear her preach, please, it's well worth your time. And I think one of my favorite things about her is that Lisa likes to eat Mexican food at the airport in Ponca City.
City. Yes.
Yes, there's
Enrique's.
Enrique's. It's a
Enrique's, yes.
Mexican food restaurant at an airport. She keeps trying to get me to go, and I
Uh-huh.
will one of these days, I promise. But I think that's really interesting that that's where she likes her Mexican food. So that's what I have, besides the fact that she is just a good
Oh,
person, and I her dearly. So once again, Reverend Dr. Lisa Barnett.
thank you, Lori. Thank you. Thank you. Let me try to get my screen up to share and get everything from current slide. There we go. The computer was taking a break. So we're moving into the last two chapters of my book that I will kind of summarize. And these are the ones that, kind of following what I appreciate about Blackhawk's book too is in his introduction, he talks about a little critique on this concept of settler colonialism that sometimes it just gets framed as Native Americans were victims, passive victims, and they're not. This is the resistance part for the Peyotes. And that's why I think I really like these last two chapters. So, one of the ways that Peyotes were able to successfully evade congressional legislation for so long was this concept of using the legal and the political systems to their advantage. Now, remember, one of the things I said was that James Mooney, that anthropologist, in that little diagram, that map that he had, misinterpreted and called peyote mescal. And so some of the articles at that time, here, the Mexican mescal beans for a racialized profile of it as well. But this idea of the mescal bean and peyote that makes Native Americans intoxicated. They're going to play on that. And so, with that, a lot of policies, state policies, territorial legislative policies, and early attempts at federal legislation kept trying to use the phrase mescal beans, the wording. And so, one of the early cases, Territory of Oklahoma versus Howling Wolf, Reuben Taylor, and Percy Cable, that came in 1907. These three peyotes were arrested at a peyote meeting, and they were charged criminally with violating the statutes of the Territory of Oklahoma that said the prohibiting the possession of the mescal bean. And each man faced the possibility of conviction for a misdemeanor offense, punishable with a fine that would range from $25 to $200 and or confinement in the county jail for not more than 6 months. So the Oklahoma territorial statute said prohibited the mescal bean. So these three individuals were arrested. They were brought to trial. And in fact, one of them said at the trial, we acted as Christian Indians and did nothing which is disrespectful to the civilized Christian religion. They got themselves a very good attorney who then started to bring in expert witnesses to distinguish the mescal bean from the peyote button. And that then is how they were able to not be convicted and not have to pay a fine or be thrown in prison, because they were able to get eventually that territorial piece of legislation revoked simply because it had been ill named. So this is one of the first cases. There's some other cases, local cases. There's a big one out of Montana as well, that talks about using the phrase mescal bean inappropriately to try to define peyote, in which they're able to do that. And I think this next chart, you can see that actually the state laws were a little bit more successful in getting passed, but there were some anti-peyote laws in Oklahoma that failed because of that mescal bean terminology. Here then is the list of the federal legislation that starts to emerge from 1916. And you start to see certain names of congressional representatives that are on there. Representative Gandy out of South Dakota and Hayden out of Arizona are the leading opponents of peyoteism and wanting federal legislation. Now, later on, around 1924, you see Charles Curtis out of Kansas, which is interesting because he himself is from the Kaw Indian Nation, and yet he is an opponent of peyote, and then Levitt from Montana and Chavez from New Mexico. But it's Gandy and Hayden that are the two proponents trying to introduce year after year after year federal legislation, along with the state legislative efforts as well. Peyotists decide to form their own organization. A peyote lobby is how it's framed in the popular press at the time, to be able to enter the political arena. And they first start with this around that Oklahoma the Oklahoma territorial legislation, as Oklahoma is becoming a state, around the Constitutional Convention and the writing, because there were some people who wanted it spelled out in the Oklahoma Constitution to make peyote illegal. But there is a delegation of peyotists who met with the medical committee and offered testimony before the Committee on Public Health, Sanitation, and Practice of Medicine that had control over the Oklahoma House Bill number 49 there. And you can see the peyotists there with their tribal designation. This is actually a better image of it, and designation of all the individuals is coming in the book. But prominent there in the center, sort of Quanah Parker is leading the way with some of the other peyotists. These are the same individuals that are going to testify in 1908 at the hearings on peyote legislation in Oklahoma. And they're able to successfully stop both the Oklahoma Constitution and any sort of state legislation from coming about as a result of their testimony. And this is really where I think I've loved the dissertation / book work. Their voices got recorded because of their successfulness in lobbying. This is another image that made it into the book, and I think it's really kind of cool. Indian lobbyist, right, for peyote. It comes out of the Bismarck Tribune in 1909. It's a delegation. There's a better picture from the book when it's printed, but it's a delegation of Osage Indians who came to Washington to plead for their sacred herb peyote. which they say is essential to their worship, but which Congress was told was used to get drunk on, right? And so here they are before the Capitol building in 1909. And then following up on that from the Tulsa Daily World in 1919, again, Osage had a really strong lobby in Washington, D.C., primarily because if you recall, if you've seen Killers of the Flower Moon or know anything about the Osage people, once the oil industry hit, they maintained the mineral rights on their reservation land, which made them the wealthiest of all of the native tribes in U.S. America at that time because of the oil. And so they had more tribal monies to be able to send people. But Quanah Parker and a lot of Comanche also frequented the state capitol as well. One of the things about their visits, which also proves interesting, and it's a part of chapter 5, is this issue of dressing for success in the white man's world of law and politics. There's actually a technical term for it. It's called sartorial, sartorial. That's the academic term, but it's really using clothing as a form of political identity. When I talked about this concept of citizenship, one of the phrases that comes up time after time in the Indian agent's reports to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs is citizens' dress or citizens' clothing. It gets picked up too in the newspapers when reporting on the lobbies. They were dressed as citizens, the suits, right? The suit became this signifier of cultural fitness for U.S. citizenship versus the, quote, blanket rhetoric, the blanket of barbarism, says some, versus those who would adopt the white man's dress or garb of civilization in some of the quotes that I'm reading. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot in terms of citizens' dress, but for white Indian reformers and missionaries, it did mean a lot. It did signal somehow some sort of, as Elizabeth was talking about, technological progress, if you will, into civilization. And so that's why I think some of the images, I hope this next image, there we go. It's just on. So here's Quanah Parker, that we normally see Quanah Parker. And there's Quanah Parker at that testimony before the Constitutional Convention, wearing his suit, right? That signifier of somehow civilized culture. A man between two worlds. One of the other things interesting about Quanah Parker, when it came to talking about being civilized, Quanah Parker had 3 wives. And the Mormons had to give up polygamy, right, in order to be more acceptable in American citizen culture. And yet Quanah Parker was refusing to even do that. So really kind of a rebel there. But it also sort of works the other way, because these ideas of white representations of, quote, Indianness. Quanah Parker, on one side, in his traditional cultural attire, represents sometimes this white fascination with the nostalgic past of the Native American. So the example here on how that also plays is Gertrude Bonin, who for a while was made the secretary of the Society of American Indians when Parker, the president, was off fighting World War I. So she ran the organization that opposed Peyoteism because it represented paganism and superstition and heathenism. Remember, she is educated at Carlisle. You see her there with her violin, right, playing concerts. But then you also see her, the postcard that she sends out, her publicity photo, if you will, of Sit Khalasa, Gertrude Bonnet, a Dakota Yankton Sioux Indian at the time. One of the things I found in the correspondence, reading through all of the correspondence of the Society of American Indians and their views on peyoteism, she talked about going to one white women's group to speak on something, and she's like, yes, and I will dress the part. And she often referred to playing the race card with this Native American dress and how she would have to put on this dress to go out because that's kind of what white people expected her to show up and look like. Well, the strategy backfires some at the 1918 congressional hearings on peyote, when she is asked to come and to testify against peyote and to support the legislation to ban it. And here's the story and the headline that came from the Washington Times on February 17th, 1918. Indian woman in Capitol to fight growing use of peyote drug by the Indians. Gertrude Bonnet, a Carlisle graduate, relative of Sitting Bull, describes the effects of this mind poison. And this is the image that came out of the newspaper. This is the image that when James Mooney, the anthropologist who lived among the Comanche and the Kiowa and was supportive of peyote, when he was asked to testify at the 1918 hearings, he ripped her on this attire. He basically said to the public and the world, she's not even dressed appropriately to be Yankton Sioux. The tribal dress that she's wearing is from a Southern Plains tribe, not a Northern Plains tribe. The belt that she's wearing is inappropriate from another tribe mixing in with that. And the fan that she's holding, of all things, is a peyote fan. So that she doesn't even know how she's dressed. She's just trying to put on a costume to appear before Congress as a Native American expert. And Mooney says it's not working. And in speaking that truth to the power, that was the testimony then that got James Mooney banned from doing any further field work in anthropology. His orders on the Kiowa Comanche Reservation, he was forced to return back to Washington, D.C. and cease doing any field work. And in fact, he died without getting to finish his book on peyote as a result of not being able to complete the anthropological field work there. But he maintained a relationship with the leaders of the Native American Church and continued to support them, even though he wasn't working in the field. But he paid a dear price with his career over calling her on her outfit at those congressional hearings. So chapter 6 gets back to this concept of religion, First Amendment, and religious freedom. Because as they are incorporating in the state of Oklahoma, and then later that incorporation gets expanded, different peyotists in different states incorporate separately after 1914, the Bannock Shoshone in Idaho in 25, the Montana Crow and Northern Cheyenne in 1925, and then later on, by 1944, the actual Oklahoma Native American Church name officially then becomes the Native American Church of the United States. And then in 1950, the Oklahoma peyotists kind of separate back out again. But then when Canadian peyotists incorporated as the Native American Church of Canada in 1953, by 55, the organization now is the Native American Church of North America in order to accommodate that transnational religion of peyoteism, if you will. But in the Articles of Incorporation, church is one of the terms that they use. And it starts out on how to be a church. As I said, the Native American Church incorporated in 1918 wasn't the first peyote church. It was actually in 1914, the firstborn Church of Christ is the legal incorporation, Firstborn Church of Christ. And again, if you're familiar with Disciples and their attorney, Henry S. Johnston, coming out of that Churches of Christ, that was even a moniker for disciples into the early part of 20th century. If you recall our involvement with the Federal Council of Churches, Garrison named it the Federal Council Churches of Christ, right? From our Barton Stone days when it was called the Church of Christ. But anyway, the Firstborn Church of Christ that was amended in 20 to the Church of the Firstborn, simply known today as the Firstborn Church, really comes out of Charlie Whitehorn, who had a revelation that he practiced peyote, but he decided to change the ceremony a little bit, made it much more Oto-centric, if you will, in some of the cultural practices around the 7 clans of the Oto people and around some of his own infusion of Christianity that came from a variety of influences from their relocation in Nebraska down to Oklahoma with the Society of Friends, the Quakers, as well as some other influences around them when they came to Oklahoma. But Whitehorn pairs with a man named Jonathan Koshaway in the founding of the church. Now, Koshaway has a really religious, varied background. He had become a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but then when he was in the Kansas City area, he was also influenced by the Russellites, right? Charles Taze Russell, the founder of Zion's Watchtower Tract Society, later the Jehovah Witnesses. So he brings a whole different sort of religious dimension, including kind of some millennialistic views about the coming day of judgment and the rebirth of lost ancestors and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. But there's different changes to these peyote rituals. Eventually, there's a separation between Koshaway and Whitehorn, and that's how it gets renamed in 1920. Koshaway is gone, Whitehorn and some others. Now, their articles of incorporation do not mention peyote at all. All right, but all of the signers of those articles of incorporation are Oto peyotists who are members of this firstborn church. But that's out of Red Rock, Oklahoma. And what was interesting is a lot of the a lot of the anthropologists doing their early work, Omer Stewart and Slotkin and some of those, they actually argue that this church went away. And I'm discovering it did not go away. It still exists as a separate peyote church today. It did not get subsumed into the Native American church. And in fact, a lot of times, if I look in the Ponca City newspaper, the obituaries, I will see that they are a member of the Oto Firstborn Church or the Oto Native and the Oto Native American Church. So you see that Johnny there was a member of the Pentecostal Church and the Oto Firstborn Church. Whereas Randall was a member of the Firstborn Church and the Oto Native American Church. So both peyote churches. So in 1918, a variety of peyotists representing different Native groupings here in Oklahoma decide to officially incorporate as the Native American Church of Oklahoma. And again, they are calling themselves a church. And they're Native American, again, as opposed to American Indian. I argue to stand in contrast to the Society of American Indians, and also because of the influence, I think, with the anecdotal evidence of Mooney suggesting that as a name. But here's their church building. It is a teepee. It is an all-night ceremony. It is certainly on Saturday nights. It is not a Sunday morning, and it's not a regular thing. A meeting has to be asked for, so they don't meet regularly until there is a need in the community for healing, for protection, for something that is called together. So different from what we would think about as a church in a Western sort of context, and yet they're using that term as a legal term for incorporation. Now, one of the things that emerges too later in the 20th century, this is from Marucas's book, The Peyote Road, is a membership card to certify that so-and-so of whatever tribe is a member in good standing of the Native American Church of North America, fighting for freedom of religion as entitled to all the rights, privileges, services, etc. And notice, of course, the two pairings of the American flag with a Native kind of cultural, but this membership card, sadly, after it became part of the Schedule I drug, becomes really important for Native American church members to have this card in order to legally sanction their use of peyote in religious ceremonies. But probably the more interesting of the terms that come out of that Articles of Incorporation in 1918, and prior to that, it has been kind of on the list. But here's Article 2 of the Articles of Incorporation. The purpose is to foster and promote the religious belief of several tribes of Indians in the state of Oklahoma in the Christian religion with the practice of the peyote sacrament as commonly understood and used among the adherents of this religion in the several tribes in the state of Oklahoma, and to teach the Christian religion with morality, sobriety, industry, kindly charity, and right living, and to cultivate a spirit of self-respect and brotherly union among the members of the native race of Indians. So there's a lot within this Article 2. Both peyotists and their supporters, prior to incorporation, when all of this opposition to their religion really kind of started, began to use the analogy of the Christian Eucharist to try to translate the peyote ceremony and practice into language that would be understandable to both non-Indians and to non-peyotists. And in fact, Joseph Springer testified at those 1908 Oklahoma hearings. We use this medicine as the Catholic people use wine as a sacrifice, and just the same as the Baptists and the Presbyterians, Methodists, and other denominations break bread and drink wine. And so shortly after then, the popular press, after his testimony, really started utilizing this analogy to convey a religious understanding to white readers that it's sort of the same, it has the same sacredness as Christians who take communion. Now, as Congress then starts to pass pieces of legislation from 1912 to 1919 to prohibit the manufacture and sale of intoxicating beverages, alcohol, right? Each time they're doing that, they're making an exception for the use of sacramental wines for religious ceremonies for the Catholics and for Jewish people with their kosher wines. But of importance for the peyotist was the religious exemption on the prohibition against alcohol in Indian country that came in 1912, when the Office of Indian Affairs issued a policy change in that Indian Appropriation Act to allow for the introduction and the use of wines for sacramental purposes under church authority into Indian country. So consequently, besides also calling peyote a sacrament to help translate the ceremony, now they're calling it a sacrament like the Catholics do for their sacramental wines as part of that loophole in the prohibition law. And it's very effective. And remember too, I mean, that's how, while a lot of denominations, thanks to the non-fermented non-fermenting of wines with the grape juice, Mr. Welch, right, and his policy. And a lot of Christian denominations are switching to grape juice in place of wine, except for a few holdouts with theological reasons. Native Americans are also then adding peyote into that sacramental purposes there. So I just find that kind of the use of the rhetoric, I think, is just really fascinating. And in fact, when I first in Lawton at the Comanche Museum, Tribal Museum there, when I met someone years ago and who happened to be a roadman, I didn't know it at the time, and I was talking about my work in peyote, the first thing out of his mouth, peyote is a sacrament. And I'm like, yes, I understand that, right? Again, trying to translate for different people. So as I remind you in the afterword, it's 65 that we get this amendment that it's a dangerous drug, followed in 1970. It's a controlled substance, listing it as a Schedule I hallucinogenic substance. And now those church membership cards are important, but thanks to that legislation, now there has to be documentation to harvest and sell peyote. There also has to be a receipt for the sale of peyote that records the proof of membership in the Native American Church. And these images, I think, come out of Marucas's book, The Peyote Road, as well. But particularly out of Texas, you have to have these documentations to grow it, to sell it, to transport it across state lines out of the state of Texas. It's very legalistic. And Brian, to your concerns, the conservation concerns, you see here the root plowing of the natural peyote habitat that's west of Oilton, Texas, what it once was, right, kind of, and now what it is today, with a lot of the natural shrubbery kind of gone. And peyote is one of those cactuses that grows low to the ground. It doesn't spring up. And so you have to look low to the ground, but that root plowing definitely destroys the natural growing environment and the plant itself. Once it's pulled out with the roots, you can't replant it. It does not grow, it dies. Which is why for harvesting purposes, you're only cutting off the buttons to dry and to harvest, because those are regenerated through the growing process. But you never want to pull it out by the root. Once you start the root plowing, that root is gone. And another Crumbo piece that I really love too. This is one of my choices as well. I was going to be happy with either one that's out in the Gilcrease collections. And again, kind of like the peyote songs, there's a lot of peyote art from a lot of Native American artists that is just really spectacular that's there. So, and I know we may finish a little early, but the final thing, I was really pleased to find out who did the blurbs for the back cover of my book. And so I put those there. One from Russell Cobb, who is a native Tulsan, but now teaches at a college in Canada. I can't remember offhand where, but I met him a couple years ago at the Western History Association conference. He writes, Barnett demystifies the practice of peyoteism without disparaging its adherents. The use and spread of peyote among Native American peoples responded to a difficult political situation in the early 20th century. And Barnett shows how peyoteism and the Native American church fit into this vast and complicated contact zone between settler colonialism and indigenous ways of life. Another author, my friend Don Fixico, that was asked to give a blurb, says, in writing about peyote and the Native American church, Barnett addresses the multiple political views of Native people, missionaries, and bureaucrats. Peyote politics is a welcome contribution to understanding the pivotal years when many Native people forged a new religion that gave them hope in the face of 20th century modernity. And the last blurb on the back, who I don't know this woman, but I use her textbook in one of my classes, and I'm a fan of her writing. Suzanne Crawford O'Brien says, My book is a nuanced history of the Native American Church. Peyote Politics powerfully analyzes the ways indigenous communities have fought for religious freedom, at times employing the very tools of the settler colonial state as a means of resistance. And I think that's kind of the takeaway from this. Those last two chapters really do show how I see that resistance coming from some of those tools that we tend to take for granted. And I think that's where, particularly when we talk about church, I think that's where Peyote really did a much better job trying to express their First Amendment rights, even when they weren't citizens, a lot of them at the time, about what does it mean to be Native. And yes, Elizabeth, Rastafarians use some of this same idea to defend their use, right, of marijuana during their religious services. And a lot of other groups, I think, as well, when we talk about, quote, mind altering, even though marijuana and peyote don't fit that category of mind altering drugs, but that there's a whole Harvard University has a group on religious history that meets regularly all around religion and substances like this to promote religious freedom with some of those substances. Yeah, I know, Monica. Why outlaw a plant? But again, not recognizing some of the value of religion and the value of, as Crow talked about, medicinal purposes, right? How many chroniclers of the Spanish exploration chronicled all of this, and indigenous people show time and again that there's a lot in the natural world that is healing and healthy. So I know I finished, I think, a little early. I don't know, probably 20 minutes early, but if we have good conversation and some good questions, I'm rushing through, what took me a few years to write and put into a couple of chapters. And when you read the chapters, you're like, oh yeah, there's a lot more here to read than what I talked about. But I want us to have some time and conversation, first of all, in the small groups for about a half hour, and then we'll come back and kind of hear what you all talked about and answer some other questions and other plants outlawed that aren't racialized first. I don't know about the racialization. I think that always kind of comes to try to promote the secularization